All right, suppose I am 22 years old, and you know me, you know my parents, and I'm just getting a job, I'm out of college, and I say to you, David, what should I do or not do to avoid bankruptcy as I live my life? What would you say to a young person?
Well, I guess one of the things that I do see is we've become such a consumer society, and we tend to think of, well, gee, I've got to have that brand new laptop, and I'm going to get the $2,000 one, and I'll put it on my credit card instead of saving and waiting until you can afford to pay cash for things. We tend to be willing to wait for enough things, and I think one of the big things is planning for that rainy day. So if you're just getting out of college, if you have the cheapest place to live there for an extra year. Bank that money for kind of the 6-month emergency fund. And, don't buy the new car, buy the used car. Just because the bank will lend you the money, strangely enough, at least in the last few years, that doesn't mean you can really afford the money they're lending you. That's a little bit different now. Things have tightened up. It's a lot harder to get a loan. Maybe the pendulum has swung a little too far the other way. But eventually it's going to loosen up, and when the credit loosens up, you just don't take advantage of it unless it's something that is going to make you money. So if you need a car to get to work, you may have to buy a car, but look at that used car where you can save some money as opposed to the $30,000 car that's brand new.
One of the things that always bothers me a bit is when you hear the commentators talk about not so much bankruptcy, they're talking about people walking away from their homes, where what they have invested, that the house is worth less than what they paid for it, essentially. And but they make it sound like it's so easy simply to walk away. But isn't walking away the same as saying that they have to declare bankruptcy to walk away from anything?
No, clearly. And, imagine the person who would walk into your office and say, oh, I'm just so happy to walk away from this house that I put my money into, I've invested, I put the down payment on, and they wanted to live there. They do not want to let that house go. That's the last thing that people want to do. So the whole notion of somebody being happy about walking away from a house just irks me sometimes.
Well, the media, we could have a whole conversation on the media and their impact and their role. But obviously a lot more people are in trouble these days. Do you see fundamental changes occurring in our society as people get themselves in trouble, have to declare bankruptcy? Do they live their lives differently after? Do they learn, or do they go back to their bad habits?
It varies. Some people have a hard time learning. Often I will be in a Chapter 13 bankruptcy, and the person's making their way through these payments, and they hit a stumbling block, and we have to do an amendment or try to go back to court to get things changed. And sometimes I'll look at that credit card statement or that bank statement, and I'll see that they've been eating out for dinner 4 or 5 times a week, and I just want to scream. But usually I think people look at it as okay, I've learned my lesson, it's time to move on, and they're going to be a lot more cautious next time.
Hopefully, yes. We are running out of time. This has been a fascinating conversation. What do you see for the future? Pulling out that crystal ball, with regard to the number of bankruptcies in terms of the market as a whole, somewhat optimistic. You had talked about housing prices aren't going to go up for a while. But overall, the economy as a whole, what do you see?
Oh, it's going to recover. It's going to be a question of the time frame. I guess part of me is a little bit concerned as to the unintended consequences of the Bankruptcy Reform Act. If all these people who in 1993 would have filed a Chapter 7 now are forced into 5-year payment plans, we're going to have a lot less consumers out there if they're tied up in bankruptcies. That could make this drag out a little bit longer. But fundamentally, it's going to come around, and I think people just have to adjust their time frames. You can't expect to buy a house and sell it for a profit in 5 years. Make sure that if you're going to buy a house, it's something where you're looking at a house that you can be there for 10 or 15 years, and then you'll be fine. So just stretch out those timelines, and this is probably not 1929. it may be a little bit worse than 1989 or 1990, but in 5 or 10 years, that house, you're holding on to it, knock on wood, our houses are going to be worth twice as much as what they're worth now, 15 or 20 years from now. And if you just keep that timeline in perspective, you'll be okay.
I like you. I like optimism because you don't see a whole lot of optimism in the press these days, so thank you for that. And thank you. I'm with David Gormley, who is an attorney in Charles County. What company are you with?
Andrews, Bunger, Starkey, and Claggett. We have a website on southernmarylandlaw.com which has a lot of this information about the bankruptcy options and a lot of other financial planning information in terms of an annual review article. So that's a good place to stop if you have some questions, too, about what we've talked about today.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for being a guest this morning. And I'd like to thank you, the listeners, for tuning in. And I hope you'll join me next week for another edition of Southern Maryland Perspectives. Until that time, I'm Brad Gottfried, President of the College of Southern Maryland.